And in a moment, I'll unmute Secretary Kondo so you can begin. And Secretary, you need to unmute yourself, please.
All right, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
All right, we are good to go.
Okay. Sorry about the technical issues. Good morning. Thank you all for attending and covering this very important step in our 2020 elections process. And just as an aside before we get started, I just want to say that I've long said that the press plays a critical function educating the public on our government, our democratic process and processes, and that could not be more true than during these very trying times. I'm not just saying that up to just to butter you up in hopes of good coverage, but that's something I really do believe. I am Jim Kondos. I'm Vermont Secretary of State and the state's Chief Elections Officer. Today, I'm going to be speaking with you about a directive that I have issued, which among other important provisions includes proactively mailing every active registered voter a ballot for the 2020 general election. As Vermont's Chief Election Officer, it is my responsibility to ensure that elections are accessible for all eligible Vermont voters and that they are secure to protect the integrity of every ballot cast. I take that responsibility very seriously. As we all know, the COVID-19 health crisis has put an additional strain on so many aspects of our society. And while I believe that Vermont will continue to exhibit a positive recovery from the worst impacts, when it comes to something as important as our elections, we must always plan for the worst. Our state and national health experts have been very clear. There is no way to predict the status of the virus in November or in the weeks and months between now and Election Day. As we begin to experience what is either a second surge of the virus or a continuation of the first surge, we must continue to plan ahead to ensure that our elections can be conducted safely, which takes on a new meaning during this age of social distancing and other health interventions we have used to slow the spread of the virus. During our planning for the August primary and November general elections, I have had two overarching goals that have been driving our decision making. One, to preserve the voting rights of every eligible Vermont voter. And two, to protect the health and safety of every voter, town clerk, and election worker. This directive is a critical component in that plan and has been carefully crafted after extensive input with Vermont's hardworking town clerks. Act 92 and Act 135 of 2020 grant me the authority to use my best judgment in making temporary changes to election procedures during this 2020 cycle to ensure that our elections can be held safely during the health crisis. While I wish we could use a wait and see approach before making changes, we know we have to act now. If the worst thing that can be said in November is that we over-prepared and erred too far on the side of caution, I will gladly take that criticism. Given what we've seen recently from this virus and the levels seen in other states, we can take no chances. Sending a ballot to every active registered voter is the state's best chance at reducing in-person polling traffic during the high turnout general election. We want to reduce that traffic to a volume that allows for proper social distancing and other health interventions to be observed at the polling place, and for the safety of our town clerks and election workers who are staffing those polls, many of whom are in that vulnerable cohort. That's one big takeaway. There is one big takeaway. Polling places will be open on Election Day. From the perspective of the voter, this process is the smallest deviation from a typical election cycle, with the only major change being that we will be sending a ballot to all active registered voters. How they vote that ballot, whether by mail, by delivering it to their town clerk's office, or by bringing it with them to the polls on Election Day, that is their choice. While mailing a ballot to every active voter may be new to Vermont, voting by mail certainly is not. Tens of thousands of Vermonters vote by mail every election cycle, utilizing Vermont's no excuse 45-day early voting period. In fact, as of this morning, the number of ballot requests for the upcoming statewide primary elections was 108,700 to be mailed out, which are typically much lower in turnout than in the November election. But what is important is that this number of 108,700 has exceeded the total number of votes cast in the 2018 primary, which was 107,600. Further, it is, let me just add that if you total the last two elections of 16 and 18, then you will see that we had 40,000 of absentee vote requests for both elections total, and we're already at 108,000. Our military service members and citizens living overseas rely on voting by mail to cast their ballots in our democratic process. And the United States soldiers have been voting by mail since the Civil War. Simply put, voting by mail has proven to be simple, safe, and secure. There are 5 states currently, both red and blue, that have been implementing universal vote by mail for years: Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii, and a large number of states with some form of hybrid process like Vermont's continuing. In response to the COVID-19 health crisis, we have seen many more states doing what they can to expand voting by mail. California, Rhode Island, and I believe New Jersey have all said they were going to mail out active registered voters a ballot for the general election. We have also seen the consequences of doing little to reduce in-person voting. We've seen in places like Wisconsin, Georgia, Ohio, crowded polling places and long lines, known contact with the virus for both voters and election workers, voter confusion, and in some cases, suppression, sometimes intended, sometimes not. And with the voters unable to wait hours to vote, many are deciding to stay home because they do not want to risk exposure. No voter should have to choose between their health and their constitutional right to vote. I repeat that. No voter should have to choose between their health and their constitutional right to cast a ballot. Vermonters deserve a choice, and I believe Vermonters know what is best for their own health and safety as they decide how to exercise their right to participate in this democracy. To those skeptics concerned about the integrity of by-mail voting, I welcome that skepticism. We should all care deeply about the integrity of our elections. I only ask that people look to the facts and the evidence and not secondhand anecdotes or baseless claims and rhetoric. Nonpartisan studies have shown repeatedly that widespread systemic voter fraud, including vote by mail, just doesn't occur. Data from the nonpartisan Brennan Center demonstrates that a voter is more likely to be struck by lightning than they are to commit mail voting fraud. Anyone can point to an isolated anecdote of individual times voter fraud has occurred. I have never said and will not say that voter fraud never happens. What I will say is that it is exceedingly rare and it is typically caught, investigated, and prosecuted. In Vermont, we have many safeguards in place to ensure the integrity of our elections. Ballots cast by mail are voted and placed by the voter in a certificate envelope containing unique voter information, which the voter seals and signs under the pains and penalties of perjury, confirming their identity and affirming that they were not unduly influenced. When their ballot is received by the town clerk, the clerk records them as having voted. Using the My Voter page, and that is mvp.vermont.gov, voters can check the status of their ballot, including when they requested it, when it was mailed out to them, and when the returned ballot was received by the town clerk. The true voter fraud in this country is to deny any eligible voter their right to cast a ballot. This is why we cannot take any chances when it comes to our upcoming elections during 2020. When voters need increased options to vote safely during a pandemic, it is my job to make sure your voting rights are protected, and I take that job seriously. In addition, my directive also includes a prohibition on candidates or their campaign staff from collecting and returning ballots that the candidate appears on, with the obvious exceptions for caregivers and family members. This was an issue that was discussed at length by the legislature. The directive also includes an allowance for the early processing of ballots by the town clerks, who will be inundated with returned ballots in the weeks leading up to the election. Now they can securely begin the process of processing. I'm sorry, let me start that one over. Now they can securely begin the processing of ballots, but not the counting of those ballots, observing strict ballot integrity protocols and a rigorous chain of command. We are grateful for the support we have received from the town clerks for this plan and its provisions. As I often say, town clerks are among the hardest working municipal officials we have, who on election day are often in their offices before 5 a.m. and don't go home until after midnight. Election integrity is their top priority. Understandably, they are concerned with how in-person voting can be done safely this year. Their extensive input and feedback has been critical as we have carefully written and revised this directive. Rather than cover each technical aspect of the directive in detail, I will leave it at that, and then more than happy to answer any questions you may have. I also have with us on this call my Director of Elections, Will Senning, who can answer any technical or process-oriented questions. If you need a copy of this directive, please contact my Chief of Staff, Eric Covey. This is an important step to inoculate our elections from this virus and health crisis. Voting is the very foundation of our democracy, and despite the many partisan attacks on the elections process that you're seeing nationally, this is neither a partisan nor political issue. Our democracy is strongest when we all participate. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, but first, I think my deputy, Chris Winters, has a few comments about misinformation and disinformation. Chris, are you there?
I'm here. Can everyone hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you, Secretary Condos. Just very quickly, and I appreciate everybody's patience on the call today. I want to thank you all for being on this call and helping us get the word out about the 2020 elections and the changes that Vermonters really need to know about. We see you as critical partners in getting trusted information into the public realm, especially as we get closer to Election Day. Before COVID, one of our primary concerns about the 2020 election was the danger of misinformation and disinformation that we're bound to see spread on the internet and especially on social media. It's a threat that's ever present, and it can be used to actually affect the outcome of an election. We want to educate the public that election officials are the trusted sources of election information. We're part of a national campaign run through the National Association of Secretaries of State called Trusted Info 2020 to encourage voters to go directly to election officials' websites. And for us, that's sos.vermont.gov. And to our social media pages, we are on Facebook and Twitter and fairly active there to ensure that voters are getting accurate election information about registering to vote and about voting, and to cut down on the misinformation and disinformation that can surround elections. So if you all do see questionable information out there, please do feel free to reach out directly to us here in the Secretary of State's office for clarification. And know that if we do run into any problems around Election Day and have critical information that we need to convey to Vermonters, you have that commitment from us that we'll be transparent, we'll be timely, we'll be clear in our communications to you as part of that relationship. So thanks again, and now I'll turn it back over to Eric to help facilitate your questions.
Okay, thank you, everybody. As a reminder, please raise your hand in the Zoom by pressing *9 on your phone or by sending me an email if you'd like to ask a question. First up, we have Paul at 7 Days. Go ahead, Paul. You should be receiving a request to be unmuted.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, how's it going?
Good, Paul, and you?
Good. Hey, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that 108,000 number means to you. I'm curious whether you think it suggests that there will be a higher voter turnout than we usually see in a primary election. And what do you think is driving that figure? Is it the postcards? Is it health concerns? Is it enthusiasm about the election? What's your best guess?
So that's a great question, Paul. And I guess I would say, first off, that we expected that we were going to see increased requests for absentee ballots this year. We're already ahead of where we were total ballots for 2018. 2016 was about 120,000. So I would say we're close. We're going to be close to that too, because we still have approximately 22 days left before the election. And that's not even talking about election day. Do we know how many of those ballots are new? No, we don't. At this time, we have our office has been so busy meeting all these requirements and working on the logistics that we haven't got time to go through who's voting and who's not, or who hasn't. So I think the question is, we expected that we were going to see increased numbers of voters this year. I think part of that is driven by the political situation we're in, but I think also part of it is the pandemic. What we've seen elsewhere, I mean, I think Wisconsin is probably the best known. That was about 12 or 14 weeks ago for their primary. They typically would have about less than 100,000 absentee voters. And in that election, they had over 1 million requests for absentee ballots. And I think that's been true pretty much across the country, that there's been a huge increase. Obviously, here in Vermont, we did send out the postcard with a prepaid return card, and that is playing an enormous role in those requests as well. We are very hopeful that we will continue to see this increase. As I've always said, the more people that vote, the better our democracy is.
And Paul, did you have a follow-up? I see your hand is still up.
Yes, just a really quick follow-up if I could. Do you have any idea at the moment how many of those who have requested absentee ballots have done so via the postcard versus other means, such as using your online portal or contacting a town clerk directly?
I don't. Will, you're right there. Do you have any thought on that? I think it's too early for us to tell. The clerks, when they receive a request, they're supposed to keep track of that, but I don't think they've done it yet.
Yeah, that's right, Jim. And Paul, it's a good question, but honestly, we just haven't had time yet to dig into the data. We will do so. When they enter requests, they do make an indication of the method. So I think the postcard requests will be entered as requests that came in by mail. They will be looped in with any other, by mail requests that came for other reasons, but those are pretty low. So I think we'll be able to count on most of the by mail being the postcards. And I can tell you that just anecdotally or by observation, the request rate jumped up when the postcards started landing and were able to be used. So we're pretty confident that there was a pretty high return rate on those postcards. And I think it speaks to the idea, the methodology, that if you make it as easy as possible for people, it results in a higher level of participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Next, we're going to go to Xander. Xander, you should be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
I
Yes.
can.
Okay, great. I was just wondering if ahead of the general, there's going to be any attempt or effort to revise voter checklists for accuracy before the ballots are sent out.
So Xander, typically that's part of the reason why we did the postcard mailing was to actually look at that more closely and try to help the town clerks with the updates. I would say that typically we try not to do too much in the weeks and months just before the election. So it's the town clerks and their boards of civil authority at the local level are the ones responsible for maintaining their checklists. Obviously we work with them. We have provided our new state-of-the-art election management system that we installed in late 2015 is working really well as far as that goes, and assists. For instance, when they go to enter someone, if they went to enter Xander Landon into the checklist in, say, Burlington, and immediately it would send them a note saying, well, Xander's already registered in Montpelier. And so that the clerk in Burlington can then send very simply a email to that clerk by just a click saying, remove Xander from the Montpelier list. So we have that. And one of the things that we will be doing is the NCOA. After the primary, we will do, just before we send the file to the mail house, we will check with the NCOA, the National Change of Address database. We will also I know that the town clerks are looking as well to have a couple of weeks before we actually send that off. Will, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I guess I would just say that that's a direct yes, Xander. We're going to do as much as we can to clean up the voter checklist before that mailing. In fact, I'd put it as almost my top priority between now and when those ballots get mailed out. As Secretary Kondo said, it's the mailing of the postcards is having the desired effect in that regard. We get emails constantly every day now over the last 2 weeks since they went out about, this went to my sister. She moved away 2 or 3 years ago. Can you remove her from the checklist? And it's that kind of prompting, people just don't do it. They'll move a couple years ago and forget to inform the clerk, and their name sits on the checklist. And this has really been doing a lot of cleanup in that regard. And then when the postcards came back to the clerks as undeliverable, that also gives them sort of evidence, at least, to look into in a certain voter record, because there are certainly instances where it's a data issue with the address somehow that it was entered that made it undeliverable, where the person may still be at the actual address if the data were perfect. And so there's a lot of data cleanup as well that will result in less of those undeliverable cards. And I just wanted to note while we're talking about it that when we mail the ballots, those will not be forwardable, and they will be returned to sender if they're undeliverable, so that as much as possible, any that don't land in the hand of the intended recipient get mailed back to the clerk. But again, that address cleanup by many means is a top priority between now and mid-September.
And it would be wrong for me not to say, too, that since we incorporated and implemented automatic voter registration back in January of 2017, our checklist is far more accurate today than it was yesterday or the day before or the day before. Typically because people do remember to go to the DMV to change their address for their driver's license, but they forget to go to the town clerk to change their voting address. And the DMV, we get a nightly upload from the DMV for any interaction for driver's license that we're then able to correct addresses as well. So it's really a combination of, it's multifaceted, and there are many places that we receive information. The death notices that come from the Department of Health get sent out to the town clerks, and so they can remove those. So there's lots of places that they receive information to maintain that list.
Great. And Xander, did you have any follow-ups, or does that cover it?
I had an unrelated follow-up. You might have mentioned this already, but was wondering if what a typical, the typical number of mail-in ballots requested on a normal year is, like what it was in 2018 for the primary and for the general.
So the total number of absentees that were requested in August of 2018 was roughly 17,100. And in 2016, it was 22,300. If you combine those two, you arrive at a number of around 40,000 for the two of them. And this year we're already at 108.
All right, next we're going to go to Stuart. Stuart, you should be receiving a request to unmute.
Okay. Let's see here. You hear me okay? It's not
Yes.
clear. Okay. Hey, Jim. Can you, I presume you are aware, saw over the weekend that the most powerful person in the world said vote by mail would rig the election. What was your reaction to that?
Disappointment. And I think that he's saying this without any evidence. And frankly, I'm hearing there's pushback coming from even my Republican colleagues around the country, and even in Congress, who are saying to him, hey, we depend on vote by mail. I also would say that the president, the vice president have been using vote by mail at least since they've been in office. So it's good enough for them. It should be good enough for everybody.
Is there any evidence of Russian interference yet?
Well, we're on top of that, and we haven't seen any telltale signs at this point in time, but we are monitoring our systems on a daily basis. We have web application firewalls in place. We just completed a test from an outside vendor, Vermont vendor, to look to see if there was any open doors anywhere. We do continue to do a weekly Department of Homeland Security cyber hygiene scans so that they look to see if there's any open doors. My philosophy has always been the more people we have looking at our system and its protection, the better off we are. Obviously, we are well aware that, and I think you all are, that back in August of 2018, we did have signs of Russian Federation attempts. They were not successful. But we've got many things in place, and every day, month, year that goes by, we continue to strengthen and pay attention to our systems. As I always say, Stuart, cybersecurity is a race without a finish line, and we will continue. It's our new normal. We'll continue to focus on it.
And you said that election voter fraud is rare and it's prosecuted. Do you know what the penalty is?
It depends on the issue. I can tell you, for instance, if you cast more than one ballot, you could be fined $1,000. If you show someone, you cannot show someone how you're going to vote at the time in the polling location, you can be fined for that. Fraudulent voting is a fine of $200. We have penalties in place for illegal influence on another person. We have there are penalties for illegal. It's illegal to intercept or destroy a person's absentee ballot materials. These are all things that are in place already and have been. It's illegal to falsely sign, destroy, or deface another person's ballot. And some of these rise to the level of criminal, some of them are civil.
Okay. And just to clarify what you said to Xander, is 108,000 a record? It's got to be, right?
For
absentee.
Or absentee ballots?
Yeah.
I would say it is. I mean, we don't have great data prior to 2015. We have some data, but it's not great data. When we put our new state-of-the-art system in place in 2015, it certainly stepped up our data collection. And I also want to this is a good time for me to say that MIT has the Election Performance Index, which they do after every general election. Now, the state rankings for 2018 are not out yet. They will be out, I would say, almost momentarily. They usually come out in the summer of the election, prior to the next election. But Vermont, when I first took office in 2012, was my first state election that I oversaw, we were ranked 38th in the nation. By 2014, we were ranked 16th in the nation. And after the 2016 election, with our new system in place, we were ranked number 1 in the nation for performance index. So it's you can look that up. You can get the detail if you want. It's again the MIT Election Performance Index, EPI, and it's really kind of the gold standard for data sets on election.
Okay, so 108,000. We must have had a primary that had more than 108,000 participants, haven't we?
Not very many. The primary in 2018 was 107,600 roughly. In 2016, it was 120,000, and I believe that is still the highest total is the 120,000.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next we're going to go to Andrew McGregor. Andrew, you should be receiving a request to unmute.
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Good morning, thank you. Do you have a sense of how many or perhaps a percentage of the postcards have been returned undeliverable?
We don't have that information yet.
Okay. And are you folks dependent on the individual town clerks to complete that cleanup before those addresses get mailed ballots?
Yes, the
November
town
ballots?
clerks. So that's a great question, Andrew, and I do want to address that to state how the law works. So the local municipality is responsible for the town clerk and the Board of Civil Authority are responsible for maintaining the additions and deletions to their checklist. We at the state level, the towns roll their information up to us, and we maintain, by federal mandate, we maintain a statewide checklist. But it's really the towns for their piece, their section of that maintains that list. So a lot of this information has to come from the town. For instance, many people think that our elections, once 7 p.m. on election night comes and goes, that our elections are over. I can tell you that our election, my election team is actually working probably real year round, but the towns are actually for up to 60 days are putting data into the system. For instance, participation rates and things like that, and it doesn't end on election day. It continues on for a couple of months.
Sure. I guess what I was thinking is if an address received a postcard for the primary, it was because, am I right? It was because they were on the active voter list. And so in order for a ballot not to get sent there in November, that address at some point between now and September would need to transition from the active list to a questioned, or I know there's a term for it, challenged address. So it sounded, based on Will's comments a little earlier, that cleaning up these addresses, or at least the attempt to make sure that you weren't sending a number of ballots to addresses that are either undeliverable or moved away is a priority. So I'm just curious if, because in St. Johnsbury, for instance, they've gotten hundreds of undelivered postcards, to my understanding. So unless the local clerk in all of these towns goes through and addresses each one of those undelivered cards, is it possible that there's going to be a November ballot sent to those addresses?
So first off, Andrew, I do want to just clarify that yes, the clerks, when they receive those cards, they're working nonstop basically these days, trying to input the data that they receive from those cards. So if they receive an undelivered card, it's very, they may check the person if there was a problem with the address, like for instance, did it not have an apartment number on it, something like that, or is it just an incorrect address to begin with. And so they'll look to their system to see what they can figure out. And if possible, if it's an undeliverable card and they are fairly satisfied, it will go into their challenge file. But Will, maybe you could address that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. And I think you just said this, Jim. Forgive me if you did, but an important thing to remember is that the postcards were sent to all registered voters, both active and challenged voters. Whereas the ballots will only be sent to active voters. And you understand that distinction, it sounds like, Andrea, but it's very likely that a lot of the undeliverables were to currently challenged voters. But everything you describe is right. And I would just say, you started by saying, are we dependent on the clerks to take care of those? And we are, in the sense that they're the only ones who actually can perform that task. But I would note that I'm just working with them really closely, and myself and my 4 staff provide a lot of guidance every day to clerks with questions about all the way down to the details of particular voters. So it's a team effort between us and the clerks to get that cleaned up.
Is there a silver bullet that if every Vermonter or every voting Vermonter was to jump on that My Voter Page website, is there one thing that you could deliver as a message to Vermonters that would really make this an easier lift for everyone involved?
Thank you. And that talks straight to the Deputy Secretary's comments at the beginning about the media being a trusted source and helping us in this effort. And yes, I think the clearest direct message out to Vermonters to help with that process is to contact your clerk and to review the status of your voter record, and that all the data in your voter record is accurate. One very easy way to do that online is through the My Voter page, but you can also certainly pick up the phone or shoot an email to your town clerk to ask about updating your voter record. And that's a great message.
My guess is the clerks would rather we steer them first to the website instead of the phone.
Probably. You're probably right.
You're probably right. And Andrew, what happens with the My Voter page? So if John Smith makes gets on his My Voter page and it has his incorrect address and he corrects it, it will actually show up on the town clerk's dashboard the next day, so that they can immediately just review it, click it, and it's added to their checklist and the change is made. So there's a lot of good that can happen from the My Voter page. Yes, there are some folks because of the way Vermont dealt with birth dates, because for a long time the birth date was not kept by the DMV. And I remember this from when I was in the Senate, and we had these discussions. We had default birth dates that were put in en masse. Like, for instance, it might say 1900 because we knew that nobody might be alive from 1900, but we would look at it from that standpoint. So, so there are some changes that need to be made from the standpoint of people may not be able to get into the My Voter page, but that's when they need to contact their town clerk to find out if the data is correct. But you're right. We encourage people to go to the My Voter page. That is the easiest way for us and for the town clerks to administer.
Okay. I don't want to take up everyone else's time, but you mentioned just a moment ago talking about the penalties for various types of voter fraud, and one of them was it's illegal to intercept or destroy absentee ballot materials. Are there special steps that someone would need to take if a ballot shows up at their address that's not theirs? I'm assuming they shouldn't throw it in the recycling bin.
Will, what would your response be for that?
My response for that is that those voters should contact the clerk is the best thing to do, to let the clerk know. And then returning those ballots back to the clerk by some means would be the best solution in that case. But I would point out to Andrew, as far as that question and your previous ones about the addresses, Just to comment again that the control point on the absentee ballot process is really the return, and that me, Will Senning, and anyone on this call can only return a single ballot for their name. When your ballot gets back to the clerk, you get checked off the checklist, and then another ballot can't come in for you either by absentee or in person on election day. And if you look back at those penalties that the secretary was referring to, and we could send them around after the call too. It's one chapter in the election law, but one of the most stringent is for fraudulent voting. And so a person who personates another, living or dead, and gives or offers to give a vote in the name of another person, or gives a vote under a fictitious name. What we're talking about here is more voting in the name of other people. They can be imprisoned not more than a year for that and fined not more than $200. So you face prison time for returning a ballot on behalf of another person. And as the secretary and I have said on many occasions, we just, in both of our tenures here in the office, we've seen no evidence of that happening in Vermont. And so again, it's the control point of coming back. I could receive 5 ballots at my house. I can only return 1.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, next we are going to go to Wilson. Wilson, you should be unmuted.
Okay, as everyone starts off, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I actually Will answered this one a little bit from Andrew's question, but I'm usually not one to pass on things I hear from my friends and neighbors, but there were 2 things that came to me that I thought are worth asking about. Somebody I know who lives in the Rutland area got a postcard, and the return address on the postcard was the Newport town clerk or city clerk. Is that type of thing common? Have you heard of this issue? And then someone else who was working in a nursing home, and I hope they weren't doing it illegally, but distributing the mail to the residents, and noticed that some of the ballots they received did not come with the prepaid. They did not come as postage paid, and little practical things like that. Have you heard of many practical problems? But I guess for the people who receive them or don't receive them, those could prove to be important issues.
So I'm going to bring Will in on this one because he knows specifically about those issues, and I'll let Will answer that. There you
Thanks,
go.
Eric. Sorry, needed my permission to be unmuted. Yeah, of course. This is the first time that we ever did a statewide mailing that I'm aware of based on the voter checklist. So it was not surprising to me that we saw some minor errors spread out around the state. The Rutland County example you're talking about, I believe, now you're going to challenge me, I believe it was voters in the town of Pittsford.
Very good. It was. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And as with all of this stuff, I heard about it right away, Wilson. And I believe it was limited to just those voters in Pittsburgh, maybe even a subset of voters in Pittsford who did have the return address to the Newport clerk. And as soon as I found out about it, I reached out to both of those clerks, the clerk in Pittsford and the clerk in Newport, and talked with them about how we could handle the issue. Basically, the clerk in Pittsford doing a bunch of outreach to her voters about the situation, and that they could readdress the card to come back to her or hand deliver it back to her. And then talking with the clerk up in Newport about redirecting any that she received from Pittsford voters back to the Pittsford clerk. That was a straight data error by the mailing house that they have taken full responsibility for, and have guaranteed me will not happen again in any similar way when we mail the ballots. That's the only one of those that I know that was on that kind of broad level. As far as voters receiving ballots without a pre-addressed or prepaid return envelope, that is an error on the clerk's behalf in using which appropriate envelope to insert to return the ballots. When we were pre-posting the August primary envelopes. So the ones that the clerks use to send the ballots out and the ones that the voters use to return them. It became clear after sort of weeks and back and forth with the Postal Service that it made the most sense to only pre-post half of those, to put a pre-meter on half of the envelopes, 50%. We sent them enough envelopes for their entire checklist. And the instruction was to use the pre-postage paid envelopes first through 50% of your voters, and then to move to the ones that require postage. But to apply that postage, the clerk is meant to apply it before they send it to the voter, and then seek reimbursement from our office for any of that postage that they had to apply. So I have seen a few instances, Wilson, where that procedure didn't get through to the clerks, and they've used some of the unposted envelopes and not put postage on them to send out to voters. And again, it's just a matter of me hearing about it and getting in touch with those clerks as fast as possible to correct it.
Okay, well, the people who receive it, what recourse do they have?
I would say contact the clerk first. And typically, if they have to apply postage, most of the clerks I know will work with them to get reimbursement direct to the voter too for that postage.
Okay.
And a lot of the times, if they put those envelopes in the mail without postage, the post office will deliver them anyway and charge the clerk's office.
Oh, okay, great.
It does vary.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
And I think it is important to recognize too, Wilson, that we mailed out around 450,000 to active registered voters and another 30,000 to the challenged voters. So if we had a few hundred that we had a little data issue with, it's understandable, but we're hoping to have cleared it all up as we go in. This is almost like a trial run as we go into the general election.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up. I'll just give one more moment. If anyone has another question or a question you haven't been able to ask, please raise your hand and I can unmute you. All right, Andrew, go ahead if you had a follow-up.
Yeah, just real quick, are you implementing any additional safeguards that you haven't normally had for absentee ballots in past elections? Are there any extra measures?
Actually, we have, Andrew. The first thing that we've done, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a safeguard, but it acts somewhat as a safeguard, is the manner in which the ballots are sent out. So, for instance, whether it's forwardable or unforwardable, and that will occur obviously for the general election. So that'll help us. But also, we even implemented in the for the general election, we will be the certificate envelope inside, which is what we call the secrecy envelope, that the voter has to place their voted ballot in and then sign it, that they are who they say they are and that they were not influenced. That envelope will have the voter's name, voter ID number, and a barcode that will assist the town clerk in making sure whose ballot came back. I'm trying to think, is there anything else, Will, I'm forgetting? That's it.
Okay, thank you.
And Andrew, I think one other thing just to remember is that when, as Will said earlier, when a voter sends his ballot back, the clerk records that as coming back from that voter. So that's an additional step where we now know that voter has voted, so that someone can't show up at the polling place or come into the town clerk's office and say, well, I'm John Smith and I want to vote. And she looks it up and says, nope, I'm sorry, you've already voted. So that kind of situation, we record that information so that that's an additional step. Any other questions? All right, folks, thanks very much for being here. It's great to have you all here, and please feel free to reach out to myself or Chris or Eric or Will if you have any further follow-up information that you're looking for.
One final note, this was recorded, so if you'd like a copy of the recording, please feel free to request from me. Also, for some of the TV folks that are on, if you want a in-person interview and you're in the Montpelier area, the secretary is happy to do a socially distanced one outside the doors here. So feel free to get a hold of me.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.